it was like...
All right, everyone. We're now leading up to the most important part of the day where we talk about next steps. But before we do that, we thought it would be useful to have each of the session chairs do a brief summary of what came out of their sessions. I would say limit this maybe to about 2 minutes each. You might stretch it to 3, but we want to leave time for interaction. And what I would suggest, the way we start the interaction is maybe if there are session chairs who want to question another session chair, do a little interrogation. That would be just fine. So I think I'm just going to take each session chair in the order that they're lined up here on the by the table. And so Craig Davies, who is Principal Environmental Advisor of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, chaired the Climate Change and Private Sector group. So I'll let Craig go first.
Thank you very much. We had a very lively discussion and interesting presentations this morning. As you said, the theme of our discussion was the private sector. We discussed that the term private sector is perhaps something that's we're not entirely comfortable with. It's a very broad and varied range of actors. We discussed how perhaps it's better to characterize them as being profit motivated. And in that context, Ralph Torrey puts the debate in context by talking about some of the recent developments over recent years, which could be considered to be setbacks. For example, the lack of progress with the COP negotiations in Copenhagen. However, setbacks can often create space for reconsideration. And perhaps we need to reconsider the development paradigm with which we've been working over the past decades, a paradigm that revolves around fossil fuels, around energy-intensive growth. Ralph gave a historical perspective to this point and pointed out that back in the 70s, the oil shocks had caused us to pause and reconsider that paradigm, but then it had been business as usual as soon as the oil shock was over. Now the challenge is climate change, and we can't simply respond with the same kinds of market tweaking that we used back in the 70s in response to the oil shock. Tweaking the markets, price signals, etc., will not be enough on their own to promote the kind of transformational change we need. What we need to meet the challenges of avoiding a 2-degree or 4-degree scenario is consistency in the policies and priorities of governments to really incentivize that change to happen. Picking up on that theme, Stephen Hazel talked about experience in Canada with a sustainability assessment of a large gas pipeline project. He also picked up the theme that the development paradigm in Canada has perhaps not moved along in that way, and used the example of this project to illustrate that point. Stephen made the point in his presentation that if a narrow approach is taken towards greenhouse gas emission assessment, it's not going to pick up all of the true impact of that project on social and economic and environmental factors, and that a broader sustainability assessment was needed to really understand the true impact of that project. And that's what was done in this case. Again, it's challenging the paradigm of a narrow greenhouse gas assessment approach to these sorts of projects. The next presenter, Ralph Silver, spoke about his experiences of working in a particularly climate-sensitive sector, that's hydropower. And he spoke about how Hydro-Quebec has been using climate change analysis to inform decision-making in the hydropower sector on the management and construction and maintenance of hydropower facilities. A few points that were made there were that a range of approaches can be used, both in terms of modifying the operational rules, the way that the facilities are managed in order to achieve adaptation goals, as well as construction and maintenance, but also paying attention to changing consumer behaviour as well. So it's also a multi-pronged approach is being pursued, and again, adaptive management. It's not simply a case of making one big decision at the beginning of the process, but it's having a sort of dynamic process of going back and reviewing project performance and then making adjustments to achieve adaptation as time goes by. The final assessment presentation was by Richenda Connell, who drew upon her experience of working with Acclimatize on a range of projects with IFIs and large corporations. Richenda made the point that there are various points in the project cycle at which climate change can be considered, from scoping right through to decommissioning. And she also made the point that ESIA is just one of the tools that can be used to inform decision-making during the project cycle and to incorporate adaptation. But it's not the only tool, and there are other tools that can be used, for example, feasibility studies or understanding better the economic performance of a project or the credit analysis of a project as well. Richenda also stressed the importance of adaptive management, and it doesn't have to be one big decision at the outset. There was a very lively discussion, good questions from the floor, and I think there was one intervention which made a particular impression on us from a representative of one of the First Nations from the Canadian Arctic region, who gave us a bit of a reality check by pointing out that the decisions taken by governments and by corporations in this field have a very definite impact on people.
I think you had to go quite pretty quickly to cover that, so I think that was good. Yeah. So next, I think it's Joe Foti, and Joe is Senior Associate with the Institutions and Governance Program at World Resources Institute at WRI. He chaired the session EIA as an Input to Climate Change Adaptation and Planning.
Thank you. So our group, we had 4 presentations, and we looked at, we tried to look at EIA as an input to climate change adaptation and planning, and most of us hit 2 out of 3. They're climate change, environmental impact assessment, and national planning. One of the big impressions I had of all of them is that where there's big gaps in policy and in participation, the outcomes are not as good. So I began with presenting a project which is ongoing called Adaptation Rapid Institutional Analysis, or ARIA, which really is a tool to help build the capacity of civil society organizations to inquire about public policy around adaptation and whether that's being developed. And in terms of EIA as an input to climate change adaptation, what I argued is that there are these rich networks, civil society, that already use environmental impact assessment as one of their main tools for advocacy, and it's a place, the go-to place for them. And so if they're able to learn about the principles, the threats, the problems of climate change through that process, then maybe they'll be able to better apply that to larger adaptation planning. Then John Furlow talked about what they're working on at USAID, and actually interestingly pointed out that NEPA does apply to foreign aid. And so as part of them filling their requirements to NEPA and to mainstreaming adaptation, they've been sensitizing projects. The way that they've done that is quite interesting, recognizing that adaptation is not the only barrier to economic drivers. And we looked at case studies in the Eastern Caribbean where communities in a participatory method identified what were the economic drivers, the things they depended on in their economy, what inputs did they need to get there, and then what were the stresses that were keeping those inputs from being at the level that they wanted them to be. And those stresses were climate and non-climate, and that allowed investment by USAID in the spectrum from things that are pure adaptation to things that are pure development. Then we had Cameron Els, and Cameron was really stressing the importance of clear presentations, access to information, understandable communication, and in participation around decision making, and looked at some of the needs both from a top-down, from the engineer's perspective, and from the bottom-up community perspective around environmental impact assessment for adaptation, and found that and showed us a great case from, I forget if I wrote down the province, in Canada, where the planning for the flood runoff worked significantly better in the area that had adaptation sensitized public participation in the environmental impact assessment process. And finally, we had Gary Middle with a really interesting examination of the province of Western Australia's environmental impact assessment. And he looked at whether considerations for mitigation had been taken into account in these environmental impact assessments, which in many cases it had, and whether adaptation had been taken into account in many of these environmental impact assessments. Most interestingly, adaptation was rarely discussed, but especially in the urban sector. So, I guess I'll stop there because I'm probably at 2 minutes.
Go a little further.
Go a little further? Okay, let me see. In terms of where adaptation was noted within Western Australia's planning, it included looking at groundwater supply, auditing existing, forestry management and fire management plans. There were environmental impact assessments for carbon capture and storage, but those actually had never gone live, the projects had never been completed. And coastal issues were not included in those.